The morning I received the phone call that would change everything, I was sitting in my office at the Pentagon, reviewing classified briefings for the upcoming NATO summit. My phone buzzed with an unknown number from my hometown in Colorado. The voice on the other end was cold, unfamiliar, and delivered news that should have brought me to my knees. Admiral Richardson, this is Patricia Henley from Henley Funeral Home. I'm calling about your father's arrangements. Your family has requested that you not attend the service. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Those words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. After 30 years of military service, after climbing through the ranks to become one of the first female admirals in the Navy, after sacrificing everything for my country, my own family was telling me I wasn't welcome at my father's funeral. But they had no idea what they had just unleashed. The relationship between my father, Captain Michael Richardson, and me had been complicated long before I ever stepped foot in a military recruitment office. Growing up in the small town of Millbrook, Colorado, population 3,200, I was the daughter who dared to dream beyond the boundaries of our conservative community. While my older sister Emma focused on finding the perfect husband, and my younger brother David prepared to take over the family hardware store, I spent my evenings reading about naval history and studying maps of distant oceans. My father had served briefly in the Army during the tail end of the Vietnam War, but his service was cut short by a leg injury that left him with a permanent limp and a complex relationship with the military. He returned home bitter, disillusioned, and determined to build a quiet life away from anything that reminded him of those dark months in Southeast Asia. The last thing he wanted was for his middle daughter to follow a path that would take her into the very world he'd fought to escape. The first real crack in our relationship appeared when I was 17 and announced my intention to attend the Naval Academy. The dinner table fell silent as I presented my acceptance letter with pride, expecting celebration. Instead, my father's face darkened with an expression I'd never seen before. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "No daughter of mine is going to throw her life away in some godforsaken uniform." My mother, Margaret, sat frozen between us, her loyalties clearly divided. Emma rolled her eyes and muttered something about me always trying to be different, while David simply continued eating as if nothing had happened. The tension in that small dining room was suffocating. "Dad, this is my dream," I pleaded, my voice cracking with emotion. "I've worked 4 years for this opportunity. My grades, my athletics, my leadership activities, everything I've done has been building toward this moment." He slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes rattle. "Dreams don't pay bills, Sarah. Dreams don't keep a roof over your head or food on your table. You want to serve your country? Become a teacher. Become a nurse. Don't waste your life playing soldier." The argument that followed was brutal and definitive. Words were spoken that night that would echo through our relationship for decades to come. He called me naive, stubborn, and selfish. I called him a coward who was too afraid to let his daughter succeed where he had failed. My mother wept quietly in her chair while my siblings exchanged uncomfortable glances. When I left for Annapolis 3 months later, my father didn't speak to me. He didn't drive me to the airport, didn't shake my hand, didn't offer any words of encouragement or support. The last image I had of him was through the rear window of my uncle's car, standing on the front porch with his arms crossed, watching me disappear down the street without a trace of emotion on his weathered face. The Naval Academy was everything I had dreamed it would be, and more challenging than I had ever imagined. The physical demands were brutal, the academic pressure relentless, and the social dynamics particularly difficult for one of only a handful of women in my class. But I thrived in that environment of structured excellence and clear expectations. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued merit over social expectations, who measured success by achievement rather than conformity. My first year was particularly grueling. The upperclassmen seemed to take special pleasure in testing the resolve of the female midshipmen, and I quickly learned that showing any sign of weakness would be interpreted as proof that women didn't belong in their sacred institution. I responded by working twice as hard as anyone else, by exceeding every physical standard, by earning the highest grades in my tactical studies courses. During those 4 years, I received exactly 3 letters from home. 2 were from my mother, filled with news about neighbors and weather, carefully avoiding any mention of my father or my military training. The third was from David, informing me that he had married his high school girlfriend and asking if I would be able to attend the wedding. I wasn't. I was in the middle of summer training exercises in the Pacific, learning navigation and ship operations aboard a destroyer. Graduation day arrived with all the pomp and ceremony that the Naval Academy could muster. As I stood in formation with my classmates scanning the crowd of proud families, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. Other newly commissioned officers were embracing parents, posing for photographs, celebrating one of the most significant achievements of their lives. I stood alone, my family nowhere to be seen, having long ago accepted that my father's disappointment ran deeper than any pride he might have felt for my accomplishments. My first assignment was aboard the USS Constellation, an aircraft carrier stationed in Norfolk, Virginia. As a newly minted ensign, I was assigned to the navigation department, working long hours in the ship's bridge and chart room. The transition from the theoretical world of the academy to the practical reality of Navy life was jarring, but I adapted quickly. I had to. The senior officers aboard the Constellation were products of their generation, men who had served during an era when women were restricted to shore duty and support roles. My presence in their operational spaces was met with skepticism at best, open hostility at worst. I learned to navigate their prejudices with the same precision I used to plot courses across the ocean, finding ways to prove my competence without directly challenging their assumptions. My commanding officer, Captain Bradley Morrison, was a gruff veteran of the Cold War, who had little patience for what he called political correctness. During my first evaluation, he made it clear that I would be judged by standards different from those applied to my male counterparts. "Richardson," he said, reviewing my performance metrics, "you're competent enough, but leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about earning the respect of sailors who've been doing this job since before you were born. Some of these men have daughters your age. They're not going to follow you into battle just because you have nice test scores." His words stung, but they also motivated me. I began volunteering for every difficult assignment, every dangerous training exercise, every opportunity to prove that I belonged in the operational Navy. When other junior officers complained about the demanding schedule or the harsh conditions, I quietly excelled. When emergency situations arose, I was the first to respond and the last to leave my post. The turning point came during a Mediterranean deployment 6 months into my service. We were conducting night operations in rough seas when a fire broke out in the ship's laundry facility. The blaze spread quickly through the ventilation system, filling several decks with toxic smoke. As the senior officer on duty in the navigation bridge, I coordinated the emergency response, directing damage control teams while maintaining the ship's course and speed. The fire was contained within 2 hours, but not before several sailors were overcome by smoke inhalation. I had remained at my post throughout the crisis, making critical decisions under pressure while breathing apparatus-filtered air. When Captain Morrison reviewed the incident report, he found my performance exemplary. "Richardson," he said during our next private meeting, "I may not like having women on my ship, but I can't argue with the results. You handled that emergency better than some officers with 10 years more experience." It was the closest thing to praise I would receive from him, but it marked a subtle shift in how I was perceived by the crew. Word spread quickly through the ship's informal communication networks that the young female ensign had proven herself under fire. The whispered conversations and sideways glances began to change into nods of acknowledgement and occasional requests for advice. My second year aboard the Constellation brought new challenges and opportunities. I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade and given additional responsibilities in the navigation department. The work was demanding but rewarding, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the technical aspects of seamanship and the strategic elements of naval operations. During this period, I also began to develop the leadership philosophy that would guide me throughout my career. I learned that respect in the military isn't automatically granted based on rank or position. It must be earned through consistent performance, moral courage, and genuine concern for the welfare of subordinates. I studied the great naval leaders of history, from Horatio Nelson to Chester Nimitz, analyzing their decision-making processes and leadership styles. The isolation from my family during this period was particularly difficult. Months would pass without any communication from home, and the few letters I did receive were formal and distant. My mother would write about community events and family gatherings, but her words felt like dispatches from another world. Emma had married and started a family, while David had taken over increasing responsibilities at the hardware store. Their lives were progressing along predictable paths while I was charting a course into uncharted waters. I began to understand that my father's rejection wasn't just about his own military experience or his concerns for my safety. It was about the fundamental challenge my chosen path represented to his understanding of how the world should work. In his mind, daughters were supposed to marry well, raise children, and contribute to the family's stability and continuity. By choosing a military career, I was rejecting not just his advice, but his entire worldview. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. I finally understood that his disappointment wasn't something I could fix through achievement or success. No amount of professional recognition would change his fundamental belief that I had chosen the wrong path. This understanding allowed me to stop seeking his approval and start focusing on my own definition of success and fulfillment. My third year of service brought my first real taste of combat operations. The Constellation was deployed to the Persian Gulf during a period of heightened tensions, and I found myself participating in missions that tested everything I had learned about naval warfare and leadership. The experience was transformative, confirming my belief that I belonged in the operational Navy and strengthening my resolve to continue climbing through the ranks. The letters from home became even more infrequent during this deployment. When they did arrive, they were filled with news of births, marriages, and local events that felt increasingly irrelevant to my daily reality. My mother would occasionally mention my father, usually in the context of his health or work, but never in relation to my military service. It was as if that part of my life simply didn't exist in their world. During a brief port visit to Dubai, I received an unexpected letter from David. He wrote that our father's health had been declining, that the years of physical labor and cigarette smoking were taking their toll. He suggested that I might want to consider visiting home during my next leave period, implying that there might not be many more opportunities for reconciliation. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I spent several sleepless nights considering his suggestion. The rational part of my mind recognized that life is finite, that opportunities for healing family relationships don't last forever. But the emotional wounds from our last conversation were still fresh, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to face another rejection. In the end, I decided to focus on my career and let time determine the fate of my relationship with my father. It was a decision that would haunt me for years to come, but at the time it felt like the only way to protect myself from further emotional damage. The remainder of my deployment passed without incident, and I returned to Norfolk with a fitness report that praised my performance under combat conditions. My commanding officer recommended me for early promotion and assignment to a more challenging position. I was thrilled by the recognition and eager to take on new responsibilities. My next assignment was to the staff of the Atlantic Fleet Headquarters, where I would work in strategic planning and operations. The position represented a significant step forward in my career, moving me from tactical operations to strategic thinking. I would be working with senior officers from across the Navy, analyzing threats and developing response strategies for a variety of potential scenarios. The transition from shipboard life to shore duty was initially jarring. After 3 years of living in close quarters with the same crew, working in predictable routines, I suddenly found myself in a large office building, with hundreds of personnel working on different projects. The pace was different, the expectations were different, and the opportunities for advancement were different. But I adapted quickly, as I always had. I threw myself into the work with characteristic intensity, staying late to master new systems and procedures, volunteering for additional responsibilities, and seeking out mentorship from senior officers who could guide my professional development. The work was intellectually stimulating and strategically important, and I felt like I was finally beginning to make a meaningful contribution to national security. During this period, I also began to establish the professional relationships that would prove crucial throughout my career. I worked closely with officers from other services, with civilian defense contractors, and with international partners. These connections would later provide me with opportunities for advancement and assignment to increasingly important positions. The personal cost of this professional success was significant. I was working 60-hour weeks, traveling frequently for training and conferences, and dedicating virtually all of my time and energy to my career. The few romantic relationships I attempted during this period were brief and ultimately unsuccessful, casualties of my unwillingness to compromise my professional ambitions for personal fulfillment. My family remained a distant presence in my life. The occasional letters from home became even more infrequent, and I found myself going months without any communication from Colorado. When I did hear from them, the news was always the same. Emma's children were growing up, David's business was successful, and my father's health was slowly declining. I remained the absent daughter, the one who had chosen a different path and was living with the consequences of that choice. As I prepared to leave Norfolk for my next assignment, I received a letter from my mother that would stay with me for years to come. She wrote about a conversation she had with my father, one of their rare discussions about my military service. He asked me if I thought you were happy, she wrote. I told him that I didn't know, that we hear so little from you that it's hard to tell. He was quiet for a long time, then said that he hoped you were, that he hoped your choices were bringing you the fulfillment you were looking for. It was the first time he'd said anything positive about your career, and I thought you should know. The letter filled me with a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me was grateful for this small sign of acceptance, this tiny crack in the wall of disapproval that had separated us for so long. But another part of me was angry that it had taken 6 years for him to acknowledge that my happiness might be relevant to his feelings about my career. I drafted several replies to my mother's letter, but never sent any of them. What could I say? That I was happy? That I was fulfilled? That I was lonely? That I missed my family despite their rejection? That I wondered sometimes if I had made the right choice? None of these truths felt appropriate to share, so I remained silent and let the moment pass without response. My next assignment would take me to the Pacific Fleet, where I would serve as a staff officer responsible for intelligence analysis and strategic planning. The position represented another significant step forward in my career, and I was excited about the challenges and opportunities it would present. I was also nervous about the responsibility, knowing that my work would directly impact operational decisions that could affect the lives of thousands of sailors and Marines. As I prepared to leave the East Coast for California, I took a moment to reflect on how much my life had changed since that angry dinner conversation 7 years earlier. I had proven myself in ways that my 17-year-old self could never have imagined. I had earned the respect of senior officers, led sailors through dangerous situations, and contributed to the defense of my country. I had achieved everything I had dreamed of when I first announced my intention to attend the Naval Academy. But I had also paid a price that my younger self had never fully understood. The distance from my family wasn't just geographical, it was emotional and psychological. I had become someone they couldn't understand, someone whose life experiences were so different from their own that communication had become nearly impossible. I was successful by any professional measure, but I was also profoundly alone. The flight to California gave me time to think about the future, about where my career might take me and what I hoped to accomplish in the years ahead. I was 28 years old, a lieutenant with an exceptional fitness record and promising career prospects. The Navy had become my family, my identity, my entire world. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. The Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor represented everything I had worked towards since leaving Colorado. The sprawling complex overlooked the same waters where American naval power had been tested and proven, where history had been written in steel and sacrifice. Walking through those halls for the first time, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a familiar uniform. My new position as Intelligence Operations Officer placed me at the center of some of the most sensitive strategic planning in the Pacific Theater. I was responsible for analyzing threat assessments from across the region, coordinating with international partners, and briefing senior commanders on emerging security challenges. The work required a level of clearance that few officers my age possessed, and I understood that my assignment represented significant trust from the Navy leadership. Captain Janet Stevens, my new commanding officer, was one of the few senior female officers in the Pacific Fleet. During our first meeting, she made it clear that my gender would be both an advantage and a liability in our working environment. "Richardson, you're here because you've proven yourself operationally and intellectually," she said, reviewing my service record. "But you're also here because the Navy is changing, and we need officers who can navigate that change effectively. Some of the admirals you'll be briefing have never worked closely with women in operational roles. Your performance will influence their perceptions of every female officer who comes after you." The pressure was immense, but I had learned to channel pressure into performance. My first major assignment involved analyzing Chinese naval expansion in the South China Sea, a project that required me to synthesize intelligence from multiple sources and present actionable recommendations to fleet commanders. I spent weeks studying satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and diplomatic cables, building a comprehensive picture of Beijing's strategic intentions. The briefing I delivered to Admiral William Thompson and his staff was one of the most challenging presentations of my career. The room was filled with senior officers who had decades of experience in Pacific operations, and I was acutely aware that my analysis could influence decisions affecting thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in military assets. "The Chinese are not merely expanding their naval presence," I explained, pointing to detailed charts and projections. "They're systematically creating a network of bases and artificial islands designed to project power throughout the entire region. Their timeline suggests they expect to achieve regional naval parity within the next decade." The questions that followed were pointed and technical, testing both my understanding of the intelligence and my ability to defend my conclusions under pressure. Several officers challenged my assessments, particularly regarding Chinese capabilities and intentions. I responded to each question with specific data and logical analysis, never allowing emotion to creep into my professional demeanor. Admiral Thompson remained silent throughout most of the briefing, but his questions at the end were penetrating and insightful. He asked about alternative interpretations of the intelligence, about potential blind spots in our analysis, and about the implications of various response strategies. I answered each question directly, acknowledging uncertainty where it existed, while maintaining confidence in my overall conclusions. After the briefing, Captain Stevens pulled me aside for a private conversation. "That was exceptional work, Richardson." The Admiral was impressed, and that's not something that happens often. "You've established yourself as someone whose analysis can be trusted at the highest levels." Her words filled me with professional pride, but they also highlighted the personal cost of my success. I was 32 years old, had achieved more in my career than most officers ever would, and was being entrusted with responsibilities that could impact national security. Yet I was also more isolated from my family than ever before, living in a world they couldn't understand and pursuing goals they couldn't appreciate. The few letters I received from home during this period painted a picture of a family moving forward without me. Emma had given birth to her third child, David had expanded the hardware store into a regional chain, and my parents were aging into their retirement years. My mother's letters were filled with grandchildren's achievements and community events, but they felt like reports from another planet. My father's health had been declining steadily, according to David's occasional updates. Years of physical labor and cigarette smoking had taken their toll, and he had been diagnosed with early-stage emphysema. The doctors had recommended lifestyle changes, but at 65, he was too set in his ways to make significant adjustments. David wrote that he had become increasingly withdrawn, spending most of his time in his workshop or watching old war movies on television. I found myself wondering if my father ever thought about my career, if he ever read about Navy operations in the newspaper and wondered if I might be involved. Did he understand that the path he had tried to discourage me from following had led to meaningful work that contributed to national security? Or did he still see my choices as a rejection of everything he valued? These questions became more urgent when I received a promotion to lieutenant commander and was selected for command of a destroyer escort. The USS Defender was a smaller ship than the Constellation, but command at sea represented the pinnacle of naval achievement. I would be responsible for the lives of 250 sailors and the successful completion of whatever missions we were assigned. The change of command ceremony was held on a brilliant Hawaiian morning, with the ship's crew assembled in dress uniforms and families gathered to witness the formal transfer of authority. As I accepted the ship's bell from my predecessor, I felt the full weight of command settling on my shoulders. These sailors would depend on my judgment, my leadership, and my ability to bring them safely home from whatever dangers we might encounter. My first deployment as commanding officer took the Defender through the Western Pacific, conducting freedom of navigation operations and participating in joint exercises with Allied navies. The crew was initially skeptical of their new captain, particularly the older chief petty officers who had served under male commanders for their entire careers. But I had learned that respect in the Navy is earned through competence and character, not granted through rank or position. The test came during a typhoon that struck our task force while we were conducting operations near the Philippines. The storm developed rapidly, with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and waves reaching heights of 40 feet. As the smallest ship in the formation, the Defender was particularly vulnerable to the extreme conditions. I made the decision to alter course and reduce speed, prioritizing the safety of my crew over the operational timeline. The maneuver required us to navigate through dangerous waters while maintaining communication with the rest of the task force. For 18 hours I remained on the bridge, monitoring weather conditions and making course corrections as the storm raged around us. When the typhoon finally passed, my ship and crew were intact, but we had fallen behind the rest of the task force. I received a terse message from the task force commander, questioning my decision to deviate from the planned route. In my response, I detailed the weather conditions we had encountered and explained my reasoning for prioritizing crew safety over operational schedule. The follow-up message from the task force commander was brief. "Well done, Defender. Rejoin formation when conditions permit." Chief Petty Officer Martinez, my senior enlisted advisor, found me in my cabin later that evening. He was a 20-year veteran who had served on destroyers throughout his career, and his approval meant more to me than any official commendation. "Captain," he said, "the crew wanted me to tell you that they're proud to serve under your command. You made the right call during the storm, and everyone on board knows it." His words validated everything I had worked toward throughout my career. I had proven that I could lead sailors through dangerous conditions, that I could make life-and-death decisions under pressure, and that I could earn the respect of professional warriors who had dedicated their lives to naval service. But even as I celebrated this professional achievement, I felt the familiar ache of personal isolation. There was no one to share this moment with, no family to call with news of my success. My parents wouldn't understand the significance of what I had accomplished, and my siblings were too distant to care about the details of my naval career. The deployment continued for 6 months, taking us to ports throughout the Pacific and involving us in exercises with naval forces from Japan, Australia, and South Korea. Each operation reinforced my understanding of the strategic importance of American naval power and the critical role that skilled officers played in maintaining maritime security. During a port visit to Singapore, I received an unexpected letter from my mother. Her handwriting was shakier than I remembered, and her message was more personal than usual. "Sarah," she wrote, "your father has been asking about you more often lately. He saw a news report about Navy operations in the Pacific and wondered if you might be involved. He's never admitted it directly, but I think he's proud of what you've accomplished. He's just too stubborn to say it, and probably too afraid that you wouldn't want to hear from him after all these years." The letter triggered a flood of emotions I had been suppressing for years. Part of me wanted to reach out to bridge the gap that had separated us for so long. But another part of me remembered the pain of his rejection, the years of silence, and the way he had dismissed my dreams as worthless. I spent several evenings drafting a letter to my father, trying to find words that might begin to heal the wounds between us. But each attempt felt inadequate, either too formal or too emotional, either too forgiving or too accusatory. In the end, I filed the drafts away and focused on my command responsibilities. The Defender returned to Pearl Harbor after a successful deployment, and I received fitness reports that praised my leadership and operational effectiveness. My executive officer recommended me for early promotion to full commander, and I was selected for assignment to the Naval War College in Rhode Island. The position would involve advanced strategic studies and preparation for higher command responsibilities. The transition from sea command to academic assignment was significant. The War College represented the intellectual heart of naval strategic thinking, where officers studied the great campaigns of history and developed the conceptual frameworks that would guide future operations. I would be studying alongside the most promising officers from all branches of the military, analyzing everything from ancient naval battles to modern cyber warfare. The coursework was intellectually demanding but professionally rewarding. I wrote papers on maritime strategy, participated in war games that simulated complex international crises, and developed expertise in areas ranging from nuclear deterrence to humanitarian operations. The experience broadened my understanding of how naval power fit into broader national security objectives. I made the decision to alter course and reduce speed, prioritizing the safety of my crew over the operational timeline. The maneuver required us to navigate through dangerous waters while maintaining communication with the rest of the task force. For 18 hours, I remained on the bridge, monitoring weather conditions and making course corrections as the storm raged around us. When the typhoon finally passed, my ship and crew were intact, but we had fallen behind the rest of the task force. I received a terse message from the task force commander, questioning my decision to deviate from the planned route. In my response, I detailed the weather conditions we had encountered and explained my reasoning for prioritizing crew safety over operational schedule. The follow-up message from the task force commander was brief. "Well done, Defender. Rejoin formation when conditions permit." Chief Petty Officer Martinez, my senior enlisted advisor, found me in my cabin later that evening. He was a 20-year veteran who had served on destroyers throughout his career, and his approval meant more to me than any official commendation. "Captain," he said, "the crew wanted me to tell you that they're proud to serve under your command. You made the right call during the storm, and everyone on board knows it." His words validated everything I had worked toward throughout my career. I had proven that I could lead sailors through dangerous conditions, that I could make life-and-death decisions under pressure, and that I could earn the respect of professional warriors who had dedicated their lives to naval service. But even as I celebrated this professional achievement, I felt the familiar ache of personal isolation. There was no one to share this moment with, no family to call with news of my success. My parents wouldn't understand the significance of what I had accomplished, and my siblings were too distant to care about the details of my naval career. The deployment continued for 6 months, taking us to ports throughout the Pacific and involving us in exercises with naval forces from Japan, Australia, and South Korea. Each operation reinforced my understanding of the strategic importance of American naval power and the critical role that skilled officers played in maintaining maritime security. During a port visit to Singapore, I received an unexpected letter from my mother. Her handwriting was shakier than I remembered, and her message was more personal than usual. "Sarah," she wrote, "your father has been asking about you more often lately. He saw a news report about Navy operations in the Pacific and wondered if you might be involved. He's never admitted it directly, but I think he's proud of what you've accomplished. He's just too stubborn to say it, and probably too afraid that you wouldn't want to hear from him after all these years." The letter triggered a flood of emotions I had been suppressing for years. Part of me wanted to reach out to bridge the gap that had separated us for so long. But another part of me remembered the pain of his rejection, the years of silence, and the way he had dismissed my dreams as worthless. I spent several evenings drafting a letter to my father, trying to find words that might begin to heal the wounds between us. But each attempt felt inadequate, either too formal or too emotional, either too forgiving or too accusatory. In the end, I filed the drafts away and focused on my command responsibilities. The Defender returned to Pearl Harbor after a successful deployment, and I received fitness reports that praised my leadership and operational effectiveness. My executive officer recommended me for early promotion to full commander, and I was selected for assignment to the Naval War College in Rhode Island. The position would involve advanced strategic studies and preparation for higher command responsibilities. The transition from sea command to academic assignment was significant. The War College represented the intellectual heart of naval strategic thinking, where officers studied the great campaigns of history and developed the conceptual frameworks that would guide future operations. I would be studying alongside the most promising officers from all branches of the military, analyzing everything from ancient naval battles to modern cyber warfare. The coursework was intellectually demanding but professionally rewarding. I wrote papers on maritime strategy, participated in war games that simulated complex international crises, and developed expertise in areas ranging from nuclear deterrence to humanitarian operations. The experience broadened my understanding of how naval power fit into broader national security objectives. During this period, I also began to develop the strategic thinking that would characterize my later career. I studied the writings of naval theorists like Alfred Thayer Mahan and Julian Corbett, analyzing their insights into the relationship between sea power and national strength. I participated in exercises that tested my ability to think beyond tactical operations to strategic objectives. My thesis project focused on the evolution of naval warfare in the information age, examining how emerging technologies were changing the fundamental nature of maritime conflict. The research required me to analyze classified intelligence reports, interview senior officers with operational experience, and develop recommendations for adapting naval doctrine to new threats. The year at the War College also provided my first opportunity in years to establish meaningful personal relationships. I developed friendships with other officers who shared my intellectual interests and professional ambitions. For the first time since leaving Colorado, I felt like I was part of a community that understood and appreciated my dedication to naval service. One of these friendships was with Major Lisa Chen, an Air Force officer who was studying joint operations and inter-service cooperation. We spent many evenings discussing strategy and leadership, sharing experiences from our respective services, and analyzing the challenges facing military women in combat roles. You know, Lisa said during one of our conversations, we're part of a generation that's breaking barriers our predecessors never imagined. Every time we succeed in a leadership position, we're creating opportunities for the women who come after us. Her words resonated with me because they articulated something I had been feeling but couldn't express. My career wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about proving that women could excel in the most demanding military roles. The pressure was enormous, but so was the potential impact. As my time at the War College drew to a close, I received orders that would change the trajectory of my career. I was being assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C., where I would work in strategic planning for the chairman. The position was typically reserved for the most promising officers, those being groomed for eventual flag rank. The assignment would take me to the Pentagon, where I would be working at the highest levels of military planning and decision-making. I would be briefing senior officials on strategic issues, participating in policy development, and contributing to decisions that could affect global stability. It was the kind of position I had dreamed of when I first entered the Naval Academy, but it also represented another step away from the family I had left behind in Colorado. Before leaving Rhode Island, I called my mother for the first time in over a year. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with the kind of small talk that people use to avoid discussing difficult topics. But eventually, she asked about my new assignment, and I found myself describing the work I would be doing in Washington. "That sounds very important," she said, and I could hear a note of pride in her voice. "Your father would be impressed if he knew about all the things you've accomplished." "Would he?" I asked, unable to keep the skepticism out of my voice. "He's changed, Sarah. He's older, and his health problems have made him think about things differently. He's never said so directly, but I think he regrets how things ended between you two." The conversation ended without any concrete plans for reconciliation, but it planted a seed of hope that maybe, somehow, the gap between us might eventually be bridged. I carried that hope with me as I prepared for the next phase of my career, not knowing that time was running out for such possibilities. The Pentagon at dawn was a fortress of marble and glass, its corridors already humming with the quiet intensity of officers and civilians preparing for another day of global responsibility. My office on the third floor of the E-Ring overlooked the Potomac River, a view that reminded me daily of the weight of the decisions being made within these walls. As the newest member of the Joint Strategic Planning Division, I found myself at the intersection of military operations and national policy, where tactical expertise met political reality. General Patricia Hawkins, the first woman to serve as Director of Strategic Planning, became both my supervisor and an unexpected mentor. During our initial meeting, She outlined the scope of my responsibilities with characteristic directness. Commander Richardson, you'll be working on contingency planning for multiple theaters simultaneously. Today you might be analyzing naval requirements for a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Tomorrow you could be briefing the Secretary of Defense on maritime security in the Red Sea. The pace is relentless, the stakes are enormous, and the margin for error is essentially zero. She paused, studying my personnel file with the intensity of someone who had learned to read between the lines of military evaluations. Your operational experience gives you credibility that many staff officers lack. Use it wisely, but remember that policy decisions require different skills than tactical operations. My first major project involved developing response options for a hypothetical crisis in the Korean Peninsula. The scenario assumed North Korean aggression against South Korea, requiring rapid deployment of American forces, while managing the risk of Chinese intervention. I worked with a team of officers from all services, analyzing everything from logistics requirements to diplomatic implications. The complexity of modern warfare struck me forcefully during these planning sessions. Unlike the clear-cut naval operations I had experienced at sea, strategic planning required balancing military effectiveness with political considerations, economic factors, and alliance relationships. Every decision had multiple consequences, and every option carried risks that could affect millions of lives. My work often extended deep into the evening, as I refined assessments and prepared briefings for senior officials. The Pentagon became my second home, its fluorescent-lit corridors as familiar as the bridge of any ship I had commanded. I developed a reputation for thorough analysis and clear presentation, skills that proved invaluable when briefing officials who had limited time and unlimited responsibilities. The personal cost of this professional success continued to mount. My days were consumed by classified briefings, strategic assessments, and policy consultations. My evenings were spent studying intelligence reports, preparing presentations, and staying current with global developments. The Washington social scene held no appeal for someone whose work required absolute discretion about sensitive national security matters. During this period, I received sporadic updates from David about our father's declining health. The emphysema had progressed to the point where he required supplemental oxygen, and his mobility had become increasingly limited. David wrote that he had been forced to retire from the hardware store, spending his days in a recliner watching television or sleeping. "He asks about you sometimes," David wrote in one letter. "Nothing direct, just questions about whether we've heard from you, whether you're still in the Navy, whether you're safe. Mom thinks he wants to reach out, but he's too proud to admit he was wrong about your career." These updates created a complex emotional response. Part of me felt vindicated that my father was finally beginning to understand the significance of my chosen path, but another part felt frustrated that recognition had come so late, after years of silence and disapproval. I wondered if pride was really the barrier between us, or if the gap had simply grown too wide to bridge. My work at the Pentagon began to attract attention from senior leadership. I was selected to participate in a high-level wargame simulating a major conflict with a near-peer adversary. The exercise brought together generals, admirals, and civilian officials to test American strategic responses to various crisis scenarios. My role involved analyzing naval component operations and their integration with joint force requirements. The wargame lasted 5 days, with participants working 18-hour shifts to respond to simulated attacks, diplomatic developments, and intelligence updates. The scenario escalated from limited regional conflict to potential nuclear confrontation, testing our ability to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. During one particularly intense session, I found myself briefing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs on naval force requirements for a counteroffensive operation. The room was filled with 4-star officers and senior civilians, all focused on my analysis of how quickly we could project power across the Pacific while maintaining defensive capabilities elsewhere. "The Navy can provide the required force projection," I explained, pointing to detailed charts showing ship positions and timeline estimates. "But doing so will require accepting increased risk in other theaters. We'll need to redeploy assets from the Atlantic Fleet and accelerate the maintenance cycle for several carrier strike groups." The questions that followed were pointed and technical, testing both my understanding of naval capabilities and my ability to think strategically about global force allocation. I responded to each query with specific data and honest assessments of risks and limitations. After the briefing, Admiral James Patterson, the Chief of Naval Operations, approached me privately. "That was outstanding work, Commander. You have a gift for translating complex operational requirements into clear strategic options. I'll be watching your career with interest." His words represented validation from the highest levels of Navy leadership, but they also highlighted the isolation that had become a defining characteristic of my life. I was succeeding beyond my wildest dreams, earning recognition from the most senior military officials in the country, but I had no one to share these achievements with. The wargame concluded with a simulated negotiated settlement that avoided nuclear exchange but left regional tensions unresolved. The exercise had demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of American military power, while highlighting the complex interplay between military operations and diplomatic initiatives. In the weeks following the wargame, I received an unexpected assignment. I was selected to serve as military liaison to a joint congressional committee investigating defense acquisition procedures. The position required me to brief elected officials on military requirements while helping them understand the relationship between strategic needs and budget allocations. The work was politically sensitive and professionally challenging. Members of Congress approached defense issues from different perspectives. Some focused on fiscal responsibility, others on military effectiveness, still others on the economic impact of defense spending on their districts. I learned to present technical information in ways that non-military audiences could understand, while maintaining the analytical rigor that military decision-making required. During one hearing, Representative Maria Gonzalez asked me to explain why the Navy needed additional destroyers when existing ships seemed adequate for current missions. My response required me to discuss emerging threats, technological obsolescence, and force structure requirements, without revealing classified information. "Congresswoman," I explained, "naval warfare is evolving rapidly. The ships that were adequate for yesterday's missions may not be sufficient for tomorrow's challenges. We must maintain technological superiority while ensuring we have sufficient numbers to meet global commitments." The exchange was recorded and later broadcast on C-SPAN, marking my first appearance as a public spokesperson for military policy. The exposure was professionally valuable but personally uncomfortable, as I preferred working behind the scenes rather than in the public spotlight. My assignment to the congressional liaison position also brought me into contact with senior civilian officials who were shaping defense policy. I worked closely with Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Chen, a former Navy officer who had transitioned to civilian leadership. During one of our private meetings, he shared insights about the relationship between military service and political responsibility. "Commander Richardson," he said, "you're developing the kind of strategic thinking that's essential for senior leadership. But remember that effective leadership requires more than technical competence. You'll need to understand how military power fits into broader national objectives, how to work with civilian officials who may not share your background, and how to communicate complex ideas to diverse audiences." His advice resonated with me because it articulated challenges I was already beginning to face. The higher I rose in the military hierarchy, the more my work intersected with political considerations and civilian oversight. Success would require skills beyond those taught at the Naval Academy or developed through operational experience. As my tour at the Pentagon neared its end, I received orders that would represent the culmination of everything I had worked toward. I was being promoted to captain and assigned to command of a guided missile cruiser, one of the most sophisticated warships in the Navy. The USS Monterey was homeported in Norfolk, Virginia, and would deploy to the Mediterranean as part of a carrier strike group. The promotion ceremony was held in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, with General Hawkins presiding over the advancement. As she pinned the silver eagles on my uniform, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders once again. I was now a senior officer with the authority to make decisions that could affect international relations and regional stability. My mother attended the ceremony, her first visit to Washington since I had joined the Navy. She seemed overwhelmed by the formal military setting, but I could see pride in her eyes as she watched me take the oath of office. During the reception afterward, she met several of my colleagues and began to understand the level of responsibility I had achieved. "I had no idea," she said quietly as we walked through the Pentagon corridors. I knew you were doing important work, but I didn't understand how important it was until today. Her words meant more to me than any professional recognition I had received. For the first time since leaving Colorado, I felt like a member of my family understood and appreciated the significance of my chosen path. But the moment was bittersweet, as my father's absence cast a shadow over the achievement. David had written that his health was too poor for travel, but I suspected that stubbornness played a role in his decision to stay home. The gap between us remained unbridged, and I was beginning to fear that it might never be closed. The conversation with my mother during her visit revealed the extent of changes in our family dynamic. Emma's marriage was struggling, with her husband's drinking becoming increasingly problematic. David was overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for our parents while managing his business. The family unit that had seemed so stable during my childhood was experiencing its own stresses and challenges. "Your father talks about you more often now," my mother confided during a quiet moment. "He reads about Navy operations in the newspaper and wonders if you might be involved. He's proud of what you've accomplished, but he's also afraid that too much time has passed for reconciliation." I wanted to tell her that time hadn't erased my desire for his approval, that professional success couldn't fill the emotional void created by his rejection. But I also knew that pride worked both ways, and I wasn't sure I was ready to make the first move toward healing our relationship. My assignment to command the Monterey represented a return to operational duties after 3 years in strategic planning. The ship was a technological marvel, equipped with advanced radar systems, sophisticated weapons, and communications equipment that could coordinate operations across multiple theaters. But technology was only as effective as the crew that operated it, and I knew that my success would depend on my ability to lead 400 sailors through whatever challenges we might face. The change of command ceremony was held on a gray Norfolk morning, with the ship's crew assembled in dress uniforms and families gathered to witness the formal transfer of authority. As I accepted command from my predecessor, I felt the familiar weight of responsibility, but also the excitement of returning to operational leadership. My first deployment as captain of the Monterey took us to the Mediterranean, where we conducted operations ranging from maritime security to humanitarian assistance. The deployment tested my ability to integrate strategic thinking with tactical operations, to balance mission requirements with crew welfare, and to represent American interests in a complex international environment. The cruise was professionally successful but personally challenging. Command at sea required complete focus and absolute responsibility, leaving little time for personal reflection or family communication. The few letters I received from home painted a picture of our father's continuing decline, but I was too focused on operational requirements to fully process the implications. It was during this deployment that I received the call that would change everything. The voice on the satellite phone was David's, but strained with emotion I had rarely heard from him. "Sarah," he said, "Dad's in the hospital. The doctors say it's pneumonia, but with his breathing problems, you need to know that this might be it." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. After years of thinking about reconciliation, about finding the right words, or the right moment, I was facing the possibility that there might be no more opportunities. "How long?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. "They're not sure. Maybe days, maybe weeks. He's been asking for you, Sarah. He wants to see you before." The conversation ended with promises to keep in touch, but I knew that naval operations didn't pause for family crises. The Monterey was in the middle of a joint exercise with allied navies, and my responsibilities as captain took precedence over personal concerns. I spent the next several days in a state of internal conflict, balancing my duty to the Navy with my desire to reconcile with my father. The crew deserved a captain who was fully focused on their mission, but I was struggling with the knowledge that I might be losing my last chance to heal the wounds that had separated us for so long. The resolution came through an unexpected source. Admiral Patterson, now serving as fleet commander, called me personally to discuss my situation. "Captain Richardson," he said, "your executive officer tells me you've been dealing with a family emergency. I want you to know that the Navy takes care of its own. If you need to return to Colorado, we can arrange temporary relief." His offer was generous, but I knew that accepting it would compromise the mission and burden my crew with unnecessary complications. I made the decision to complete the deployment, trusting that my father would understand the professional obligations that prevented me from rushing home. It was a decision I would regret for the rest of my life. 3 days before Monterey was scheduled to return to Norfolk, I received another call from David. This time his voice was hollow with grief. "Sarah, I'm sorry. Dad passed away this morning. He was asking about you at the end." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I maintained my composure on the bridge of my ship. I had trained for decades to function under pressure, to make decisions despite personal pain, and to fulfill my responsibilities regardless of emotional cost. But this was different. This was the end of possibilities, the closing of a door that could never be reopened. The funeral arrangements were made quickly, with services scheduled for the day after our return to Norfolk. I planned to fly directly to Colorado, to stand beside my family as we said goodbye to the man who had shaped all of our lives, even when we disagreed with his choices. But my family had other plans. The phone call from the funeral director was brief and devastating, delivered with the kind of professional detachment that made the message even more painful. "Admiral Richardson," the voice said, "I'm calling about your father's arrangements. Your family has requested that you not attend the service." The words echoed in my mind as I stood in my Pentagon office, 30 years of military service and countless professional achievements suddenly seeming meaningless. I had sacrificed everything for my career, had proven myself in ways that should have made any father proud, and had earned recognition from the highest levels of military leadership. But I was still the daughter who had been rejected, the family member who had chosen a different path and was now paying the ultimate price for that choice. The funeral director's words echoed in my mind for hours after I hung up the phone. "Your family has requested that you not attend the service." 30 years of military service, countless deployments, missed holidays, and sacrificed relationships had all led to this moment of ultimate rejection. I sat in my Pentagon office, staring at the Potomac River through bulletproof glass, feeling more isolated than I had ever felt in my life. My first instinct was to call David, to demand an explanation, to fight for my right to mourn my father alongside the rest of my family. But something held me back. Maybe it was military discipline, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the final acceptance that the bridge between us had been burned beyond repair. I made a different call instead. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Torres, my aide-de-camp, answered on the first ring. "Torres, I need you to book me a flight to Denver. Commercial, not military transport. I'll be traveling in civilian clothes." "Ma'am, should I arrange for security detail?" "No, this is personal business. I'll handle it myself." The flight to Denver gave me time to process the magnitude of what was happening. I had been promoted to Admiral 6 months earlier, making me one of the youngest flag officers in Navy history. I commanded the respect of thousands of sailors, had briefed presidents and prime ministers, and had been entrusted with some of the most sensitive operations in the Pacific Theater. Yet I was being treated like a stranger by my own family. The rental car smelled like artificial pine and stale coffee. I drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook, past the high school where I had first dreamed of naval service, past the library where I had studied maps of distant oceans. The town hadn't changed much in 30 years, but I felt like a visitor from another planet. I checked into the Millbrook Inn, a small hotel that hadn't existed when I was growing up. The desk clerk, a woman about my age, looked at me with curious recognition. "You're Sarah Richardson, aren't you? Michael's daughter? I heard you were some kind of important military officer now." "Something like that," I replied, not wanting to discuss my rank or career with a stranger. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man. Stubborn as hell, but good." Her words stung because they contained a truth I had been avoiding. My father had been a good man, flawed but fundamentally decent. Our conflict hadn't been about his character but about his inability to understand my choices, and my unwillingness to compromise my dreams for his approval. That evening, I drove past the funeral home where my father's body lay in state. The parking lot was full of pickup trucks and family cars, evidence of the community's support that had sustained my family through difficult times. I sat in my rental car, watching neighbors and friends enter the building to pay their respects, feeling like an outsider looking into a world I had once belonged to. I didn't go inside. Instead, I drove to the cemetery where the service would be held the next morning. Mountain View Cemetery occupied a hillside overlooking the town, its headstones weathered by decades of Colorado winters. I found my father's gravesite, marked by a temporary placard and surrounded by funeral flowers. Standing beside the open grave, I finally allowed myself to grieve. Not just for my father's death, but for the relationship we had never been able to repair, for the words that had gone unspoken, for the pride and stubbornness that had kept us apart. I cried for the first time since David's phone call, letting 30 years of suppressed emotion pour out into the mountain air. The next morning, I dressed in my navy dress blue uniform. If my family was going to exclude me from the funeral, I would at least honor my father in the way I knew best. The uniform represented everything that had separated us, but it also represented the discipline, honor, and service that I hoped he had eventually come to understand. I arrived at the cemetery early, positioning myself on a hill overlooking the service area. From that vantage point, I could observe the proceedings without interfering with my family's wishes. I watched through binoculars as the hearse arrived, followed by a long line of cars carrying mourners. The service was simple and dignified, conducted by Pastor Williams from the Methodist church my family had attended for decades. I could see my mother in the front row, supported by Emma and David, their faces etched with grief. Community members filled the remaining chairs, testimony to the respect my father had earned through decades of honest work and quiet generosity. When Pastor Williams invited people to share memories, several neighbors spoke about my father's willingness to help with repairs, his knowledge of hardware and tools, his dry sense of humor. David spoke about learning the business from him, about the patience he had shown in teaching practical skills. Emma talked about his devotion to family, about how he had worked extra hours to pay for her wedding. No one mentioned his military service. No one mentioned me. The American flag draped over the coffin fluttered in the mountain breeze, and I found myself thinking about the disconnect between my father's brief Army service and his later opposition to my naval career. Had he been protecting me from something he had experienced? Had his rejection been motivated by love rather than disappointment? As the service concluded and mourners began to disperse, I remained on the hillside, watching my family accept condolences from friends and neighbors. This was supposed to be the end of the story, the final chapter in a relationship that had been broken for 3 decades. But then I heard them. The sound of marching feet, disciplined and precise, echoed across the cemetery. I turned to see 15 men in navy dress uniforms approaching the gravesite in perfect formation. They moved with the fluid precision of special operations personnel, their ribbons and insignia indicating extensive combat experience. At their head was Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Rodriguez, a Navy SEAL I had worked with during a classified operation in the Persian Gulf. Behind him marched 14 other SEALs, each one a veteran of the most dangerous missions the Navy undertook. They had come to honor my father, but more importantly, they had come to honor me. The mourners at the gravesite fell silent as the SEALs approached. My family looked confused, uncertain why these warriors had appeared at a hardware store owner's funeral. But I understood. These men had heard about my situation through the informal networks that connect military personnel across the globe. They had come to demonstrate something my family had never fully grasped, that my service mattered, that my sacrifices had meaning, that my father's daughter had earned the respect of America's finest warriors. Master Chief Rodriguez called his men to attention, their synchronized movements creating a powerful display of military precision. He then turned toward the hillside where I stood, located me through some form of tactical awareness I had never fully understood, and rendered a crisp salute. "Admiral, ma'am," his voice carried across the cemetery, clear and strong. The 14 SEALs behind him followed suit, their salutes creating a tableau of honor and respect that transformed the entire atmosphere of the funeral. These men had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments in the military, had fought in conflicts around the world, had risked their lives for national security. Yet they were honoring me, acknowledging my leadership and my service in front of my family and community. The silence stretched for several heartbeats as the implications of the moment sank in. My mother's face showed a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Emma and David exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand something they had never grasped before. The other mourners stared in amazement at this unexpected display of military honor. Master Chief Rodriguez maintained his salute for a full 30 seconds, a gesture that spoke volumes about the respect I had earned among the warriors I had led. When he finally lowered his hand, he spoke again. "Your father would be proud, Admiral. You've served with honor." The SEALs executed a perfect about-face and marched away with the same precision they had displayed upon arrival. But their message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. I was not just Michael Richardson's daughter who had disappointed her family. I was Admiral Sarah Richardson, a leader who had earned the respect of America's most elite warriors. The cemetery remained silent for several minutes after the SEALs departed. I could see my family standing beside the grave, processing what they had just witnessed. Other mourners whispered among themselves, trying to understand the significance of what had just occurred. Slowly, I made my way down the hillside toward the grave site. My family watched my approach, with expressions ranging from uncertainty to something that might have been recognition. I was no longer the rebellious teenager who had defied her father's wishes. I was a senior military officer whose service had earned acknowledgement from the most elite warriors in the American military. My mother was the first to speak. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea. I never understood what you had accomplished." Emma and David remained silent, but their faces showed a mixture of embarrassment and newfound respect. They had excluded me from the funeral based on their assumption that I was still the selfish daughter who had abandoned her family for personal ambition. The SEAL's salute had forced them to confront a different reality. "He asked about you at the end," David said finally. "Dad kept asking if you were safe, if you were happy. I think he knew he had made a mistake, but he didn't know how to fix it." The words carried weight because they came from someone who had been present during my father's final days, someone who had heard his private thoughts and regrets. Maybe reconciliation had been possible after all, if pride and stubbornness hadn't stood in the way. "I loved him," I said simply. "I never stopped loving him, even when we couldn't find a way to understand each other." My mother stepped forward and embraced me, the first physical contact we had shared in years. "He loved you too, Sarah. He was just too proud to admit he was wrong about your career." The embrace lasted several minutes, both of us crying for the relationship that had been lost and the time that couldn't be recovered. Emma and David joined us, creating a family circle that had been broken for 3 decades. As we stood together beside my father's grave, I realized that the SEALs' intervention had accomplished something that years of achievement and recognition had failed to achieve. They had demonstrated to my family that my service was not just a career choice but a calling that had earned the respect of the most elite warriors in the American military. The funeral director approached us hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the dramatic turn of events. "Admiral Richardson," he said, "I apologize for the earlier confusion. There seems to have been a misunderstanding about the service arrangements." I looked at my family, seeing in their faces a mixture of regret and newfound understanding. The exclusion from the funeral had been based on old wounds and misunderstandings, not on current reality. "There's no confusion," I replied. "I'm here to honor my father alongside my family." The graveside service concluded with the folding of the American flag, a ritual I had witnessed countless times during my naval career. But this time was different. This time the flag was being folded for my father, presented to my mother in recognition of his service to his country. As the flag was placed in my mother's hands, I understood something that had eluded me for 30 years. My father's opposition to my military career hadn't been about his lack of respect for service. It had been about his fear that I would experience the same disillusionment and pain that had marked his own brief time in uniform. His rejection had been motivated by love, not by disappointment. He had been trying to protect me from a world he believed would hurt me, just as it had hurt him. The irony was that the military had become the source of my greatest achievements and deepest fulfillment. After the service, the family gathered at my mother's house for a traditional post-funeral meal. The house was filled with neighbors and friends, all of whom seemed curious about my uniform and the dramatic events at the cemetery. I found myself answering questions about my career, explaining my rank and responsibilities to people who had known me as a child. The conversations were awkward at first, but gradually became more natural as people began to understand the scope of my achievements. Several neighbors mentioned that my father had kept newspaper clippings about Navy operations. wondering if I might have been involved. Others recalled his quiet pride when my name had appeared in the local paper after my promotion to Admiral. "He never said anything directly," said Mrs. Patterson, our next-door neighbor, "but I could tell he was proud. He just didn't know how to express it after all those years of silence." Her words provided another piece of the puzzle, another indication that my father's feelings had been more complex than his actions had suggested. The stubborn pride that had kept us apart had also prevented him from acknowledging the respect he had gradually developed for my achievements. As the evening wound down and neighbors began to depart, I found myself alone with my immediate family for the first time in years. The conversation was tentative at first, filled with the careful politeness that people use when they're not sure what topics are safe to discuss. Eventually, David asked the question that had been hanging in the air all day. "Sarah, why didn't you tell us about your promotions, your assignments, your achievements? We had no idea you had become so successful." It was a fair question, one that required me to examine my own pride and stubbornness. "I stopped sharing because I felt like you weren't interested. After Dad made it clear that he disapproved of my career choice, I assumed the family had written me off." "We thought you had written us off," Emma replied. "Your letters became so formal, so distant, we didn't know how to bridge the gap." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. We talked about missed opportunities, about assumptions and misunderstandings, about the price of pride and the cost of silence. Both sides had contributed to the estrangement. Both sides had allowed wounded feelings to prevent reconciliation. "I wish Dad could have seen what happened today," my mother said. "Those sailors who came to honor you. I think he would have finally understood what your service means." "He knew," I replied. "Maybe not consciously, but somewhere inside, he knew. That's why he was asking about me at the end." The next morning, I visited my father's grave alone. The flowers from the funeral were still fresh, and the newly turned earth created a stark contrast with the established headstones around it. I stood there for a long time, finally able to say the words I had been rehearsing for 30 years. "I'm sorry we couldn't find a way to understand each other," I said aloud. "I'm sorry pride kept us apart. I'm sorry I waited too long to come home." The mountain wind carried my words away, but speaking them had been important. I had finally acknowledged my own role in our estrangement, had finally accepted that reconciliation requires effort from both sides. As I prepared to leave Colorado, I made a commitment to my family that I would do better, that I would share my life with them in ways I had never done before. The SEALs intervention had given us a second chance, an opportunity to build the relationships that pride and stubbornness had prevented. The flight back to Washington gave me time to reflect on the events of the previous few days. I had attended my father's funeral after all, had been honored by warriors whose respect meant more than any medal or promotion. I had reconnected with my family and begun the process of healing wounds that had festered for decades. But most importantly, I had learned that service and family don't have to be mutually exclusive, that professional achievement and personal relationships can coexist if both sides are willing to make the effort. The SEALs had reminded me that honor isn't just about individual achievement but about the connections we forge with others. Master Chief Rodriguez was waiting for me at the Pentagon when I returned to duty. His presence in my office was both unexpected and touching, evidence that the bonds forged in military service extend far beyond official duty relationships. "Admiral," he said, "I wanted to make sure you knew that what we did in Colorado wasn't just about honoring you, it was about honoring what you represent. You've opened doors for women in the military that were closed when you started your career. You've proven that leadership isn't about gender, but about character." His words reminded me that my journey had been about more than personal achievement. Every barrier I had broken, every challenge I had overcome, every promotion I had earned, had created opportunities for the women who would follow. The SEAL's salute had been acknowledgement not just of my service but of the path I had blazed for others. As I settled back into my Pentagon routine, I carried with me the memory of that moment in the cemetery when 15 elite warriors had demonstrated that respect is earned through service, not inherited through birth. My father's funeral had ended differently than anyone had expected, but it had ended with honor, recognition, and the beginning of healing. The phone call from the funeral director had been intended to exclude me from my father's final tribute. Instead, it had led to a moment of profound recognition, a demonstration of the respect I had earned through 30 years of dedicated service. The SEALs who saluted me that day had given me something more valuable than any medal or promotion. They had given me the understanding that my sacrifices had meaning, that my service had value, and that the family I had chosen in the military would never abandon me. Standing beside my father's grave, wearing the uniform he had once rejected, I had finally found peace with the choices I had made and the price I had paid. The SEAL's salute had been the final validation of a career built on honor, courage, and commitment to something greater than personal ambition. In the end, my father's funeral had become not just a goodbye, but a celebration of service, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that connect those who have dedicated their lives to defending their country. The 15 men who had honored me that day had reminded everyone present that some achievements transcend family approval, that some forms of service earn recognition that no amount of disappointment can diminish. I was Admiral Sarah Richardson, and I had earned my place among America's warriors through 3 decades of dedicated service. The SEAL's salute had made that truth impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, and impossible to forget. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.